What does it look like when the very first combat parachute jump in the history of the United States Army goes wrong almost from the moment the aircraft leave the ground? What do you do when your entire mission plan depends on flying 1,100 miles across a bay, over a neutral country that could shoot you down for the crime of simply passing overhead, to jump onto an airfield you have never seen in person? And what happens when, at the exact moment you're supposed to be landing on that airfield, only 10 of your 39 aircraft actually manage to drop their troops anywhere close to the target, while the rest, dangerously low on fuel, put down instead on a dry salt lake nowhere near where the plan said you would be? On November 8, 1942, the 2nd Battalion, 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment attempted exactly this mission over Algeria, and one exhausted paratrooper summed up the entire operation afterward in 4 words: "Night flight to SNAFU. We'll show you exactly what went wrong and what went right anyway in a moment." First, you need to understand why the United States Army was willing to risk an entirely new, untested form of warfare on a mission this ambitious in the first place. This is the story of America's first combat jump. This is the story of Operation Torch's airborne assault on Oran. The threat by the autumn of 1942, Allied planners had settled on North Africa as the location for the first major joint American and British offensive of the entire war. A massive invasion codenamed Operation Torch that would land more than 107,000 troops across 3 separate task forces along the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. The political situation the invasion force would face on landing was genuinely uncertain. French colonial forces in North Africa remained nominally loyal to the collaborationist Vichy government, technically allied with Germany, and whether those French troops would fight the incoming Americans and British or stand aside remained an open question that Allied planners could not resolve with confidence before the invasion actually began. Near the city of Oran in Algeria, 2 airfields, Lassinia and Tafareui, represented the only runways in the entire region capable of sustained air operations, with Tafareui offering the sole hard-surfaced runway available anywhere nearby. Vichy French fighter aircraft based at these fields sat within easy striking distance of the invasion beaches where the center task force, 18,500 American troops of the 1st Infantry and 1st Armored Divisions, would be coming ashore. Securing those airfields before the amphibious landings began, denying Vichy aircraft the ability to strike the beaches, and simultaneously opening a route for Allied reinforcement and resupply, was judged important enough that planners were willing to accept the very real risks of an entirely new and unproven kind of operation. A combat parachute assault flown not from a nearby staging base, but directly from airfields in England. A distance of more than 1,100 miles that would require the transport aircraft to cross the Bay of Biscay and pass directly over neutral Spain before ever reaching North African airspace at all. The sheer novelty of what planners were proposing cannot be overstated within the context of American military capability in late 1942. No American airborne unit had ever executed a combat jump of any kind, let alone one requiring an entire night's flight across open ocean and foreign airspace, with no opportunity to refuel or divert if navigation went wrong. The 2nd Battalion, 503rd Parachute Infantry, redesignated as the 2nd Battalion, 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment mere days before the operation began, represented the entirety of America's available combat-tested airborne expertise at that point in the war. A unit whose training, however rigorous, had never been tested under the specific and unforgiving conditions this particular mission would demand. Every element of the plan, from the distance involved to the reliance on aircraft crews navigating almost entirely by dead reckoning over unfamiliar terrain at night, represented uncharted territory for the United States military. The secret development, there was no secret weapon behind the airborne assault on Oran. What there was, instead, was an operation of genuinely audacious ambition, planned and executed with technology and navigational tools that left almost no margin for the kind of errors that inevitably occur when nearly 40 aircraft attempt to fly over 1,000 miles of ocean and neutral territory at night to reach a target most of the pilots had never seen. Lieutenant Colonel Edson Raff, commanding the mission, had trained his paratroopers with a specific philosophy in mind, insisting that every man be prepared to fight aggressively and independently on the ground in Africa, alone if necessary, understanding that a mission of this complexity and distance made some degree of scattered, disorganized landing almost inevitable regardless of how carefully the operation was planned. That preparation would prove essential almost immediately. The mission's political framework added its own layer of complexity on top of the navigational challenge. Diplomatic contacts with sympathetic French officers in North Africa had raised hope that Vichy forces might stand down rather than fight, and a coded radio message, "Advance Alexis," was sent during the mission's final hours, indicating that a peace arrangement was believed to be in effect, and that American forces should expect a stand-down rather than combat resistance from the French troops they would encounter on landing. Whether that diplomatic understanding would actually hold once armed American paratroopers began descending directly onto and around positions held by French colonial troops remained to be seen, and it would be tested almost immediately once the scattered aircraft finally began reaching African airspace after a flight lasting through the entire night. The final hours before departure were themselves marked by exactly the kind of compounding logistical difficulty that would characterize the entire mission. According to Colonel William Bentley, the mission's air commander, only 4 of the 39 aircraft assigned to the operation were confirmed fully mission-capable in the days immediately preceding departure, the remainder still undergoing overhaul and modification work at a maintenance center in England that had not been completed in time. Weather delays further complicated the movement of aircraft and equipment to the departure airfields at St. Ival and Predanac in Cornwall, forcing last-minute improvisation in exactly the kind of high-stakes circumstances that left planners with little choice, but to proceed regardless of how many of these preparatory problems had actually been fully resolved before the mission launched. Technical supremacy. There is no chapter in this story about a mission executed with precision, because the technical reality of the operation was defined almost entirely by how much went wrong, and by how effectively individual paratroopers and pilots improvised once their carefully planned operation began falling apart over the African coast. Of the 39 aircraft that had departed English airfields, only a small fraction actually managed to drop their paratroopers anywhere near the intended targets. Whether problems, aircraft that had failed to receive planned modifications before departure, and the sheer navigational difficulty of locating 2 specific airfields after an entire night's flight across open ocean and unfamiliar terrain combined to scatter the formation badly. Roughly 30 of the 37 aircraft that actually completed the flight experienced enough trouble reaching their intended drop zones that their pilots made the decision to land directly rather than risk a scattered jump, setting their heavily loaded transports down on the Sebka Doran, a dry salt lake bed nowhere near either targeted airfield, to unload their paratroopers on the ground instead. Only 10 aircraft actually dropped their troops by parachute as originally planned, landing paratroopers directly into and around trenches filled with combat troops and heavy weapons belonging to the Vichy 3rd Zouave Regiment. close enough that descending American paratroopers found themselves floating down almost directly on top of an armed and alert enemy position. What saved the mission from immediate disaster in that specific, dangerous moment was not any technical solution, but the diplomatic groundwork laid before the operation began. The Vichy soldiers occupying those trenches, briefed by their own officers on the possibility that French forces might not resist the American landing, held their fire as the scattered paratroopers descended directly among them, an outcome that owed considerably more to political arrangement than to any element of the airborne plan itself. Private Tommy Mac Call, mortally wounded by French fire during the broader confusion of the landing, despite the general stand down, would later be honored when the Army named its airborne training center near Fort Bragg in his memory. A reminder that even amid a mission where outright combat had been largely avoided, the operation was not entirely without cost. The paratroopers who landed via the improvised Salt Lake landing rather than an actual jump faced their own distinct set of challenges once on the ground. Challenges that had nothing to do with enemy resistance and everything to do with the sheer logistics of reorganizing a scattered force in unfamiliar terrain. Officers and non-commissioned officers found themselves accounting for men and equipment that had been distributed across nearly 30 separate aircraft landing sites rather than concentrated in a single planned drop zone, a task complicated by the Salt Lake's featureless terrain, offering few reliable landmarks for coordinating a rapid reassembly. That the battalion managed to reorganize itself and move on its objectives within a reasonably short window after landing, despite this scattered starting position, reflects directly on the emphasis Raff had placed during training on independent action and small unit initiative, doctrine that was being tested in genuinely improvised, real-world conditions for the first time. The global impact, despite the navigational chaos and the scattered, improvised landings, the mission's core objective was ultimately achieved. Both targeted airfields, Lacinia and Tafarayui, were secured, denying Vichy aircraft the ability to strike the invasion beaches, and opening the airfields for Allied use in the days that followed as the broader North African campaign developed. The operation demonstrated, in the most direct and unforgiving way possible, exactly what an airborne assault of this ambition and distance actually required. Lessons that American airborne planners would carry forward into the far larger and more consequential airborne operations that followed in Sicily, Italy, and eventually Normandy. The scattered landing pattern that defined the mission's execution became, somewhat paradoxically, one of its most instructive legacies. American airborne doctrine that emerged over the following 2 years placed enormous emphasis on training individual paratroopers to operate independently and aggressively, even when landing far from their intended objectives, and separated from their units. A doctrine that traces its practical origins directly back to lessons learned over the Sebka Doran on the night of November 7th into 8th, 1942. Raff's own insistence that every paratrooper be prepared to fight alone if necessary. A philosophy shaped by his own realistic expectations about how badly a mission of this complexity could scatter proved prescient almost immediately once his own men found themselves landing in a dry lake bed nowhere near their target, forced to improvise, regroup, and complete their objective anyway. The broader North African campaign that followed Operation Torch's initial landings would eventually draw the 509th into direct, sustained combat against German forces as well. A transition captured in one account describing the paratroopers gaining a hard-fighting reputation, especially in engagements against the German Afrika Korps in the weeks and months following the initial Oran assault. That subsequent combat record, built on the foundation of a first mission that had gone wrong in nearly every technical particular, demonstrates something important about how the United States Army actually absorbed and applied the lessons of its earliest airborne operations. Rather than treating the chaos over Oran as evidence that large-scale airborne assault was unworkable, planners studied exactly what had gone wrong, incorporated those lessons into subsequent training and mission planning, and proceeded to conduct progressively larger and more ambitious airborne operations throughout the remainder of the war. Each one benefiting from hard lessons, the 509th had learned the difficult way during America's very first attempt. Conclusion: the 2nd Battalion, 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment's assault on Oran holds a permanent place in American military history simply by virtue of being first. The earliest combat parachute jump the United States Army ever conducted, executed at a moment when the entire concept of airborne warfare remained largely theoretical and untested under actual combat conditions. That the mission succeeded despite navigational chaos, scattered landings, and an operation that unfolded in nearly every respect differently from how it had been planned, speaks less to the precision of the original plan than to the adaptability of the men who executed it once that plan began falling apart. The paratrooper who summarized the entire operation as a night flight to SNAFU was not exaggerating for effect. Nearly every element of the mission, from the aircraft that failed to receive planned modifications before departure, to the weather that scattered the formation across hundreds of miles of African coastline, to the diplomatic uncertainty over whether landing paratroopers would be met with gunfire or a stand down, represented exactly the kind of compounding uncertainty that defines a genuinely new form of warfare being attempted for the first time under real combat conditions. What the Vichy French soldiers who watched American paratroopers descend directly into their own trenches on the morning of November 8th actually made of the moment is preserved mostly in the simple fact of what did not happen next. They held their fire. The airfields fell within hours, and a fledgling American airborne force that had just survived its own chaotic introduction to combat carried the lessons of that single confused night forward into every major airborne operation the United States Army would conduct for the remainder of the war.